Mark chapter 12. One of the great things about the Bible is that it is full of all sorts of very helpful things, and one of those things is wisdom. Wisdom about all sorts of things, including God. And in the Old Testament, we see wisdom found in the book of Proverbs in particular, and these are the wise sayings that Solomon collected on, all sorts of subjects. So if we ask where in the New Testament do we find wisdom, there are a couple of answers. The book of James is often pointed to as practical wisdom. Paul's words certainly contain wisdom about life, but really the height of of wisdom in the New Testament, in fact in the entire Bible, is the words of Jesus. Jesus' words and teachings and sayings are full of profound wisdom. And one of the places that we see the wisdom of Jesus is in his parables. In the parables, Jesus teaches us about the kingdom of God. And a parable is a comparison. That's what the word parable literally means. These are comparisons that use an earthly object or situation to talk about heavenly mysteries and realities. So in Mark chapter 12, we open with what has come to be called the parable of the wicked tenants. Now remember that this is Tuesday of Holy Week and Jesus is teaching in the temple. He's just been asked a question by the chief priests and elders but refused to answer. So this parable is a response to the hypocrisy of the religious leadership. Jesus says that there was a certain man who had a vineyard. He did everything that he needed to do so that the vineyard would produce good fruit, and then he leased it out to tenants. Well, this kind of situation happened in that era, and so people were accustomed to this idea. There are a number of stories from the life of Herod the Great, for example, in which he would bring order to a region and then leave, but when he left, all sorts of chaos would break out in his absence, and he would eventually have to come back and deal with things in person. So the owner here is absent, and the tenants rebel. They don't give him the portion of the produce that's due him, even though he sends servants to collect it. Well, the twist in the story comes when he decides to send his beloved son to them, thinking they will respect him. As a listener, we immediately realize this is a bad idea, but he does it anyway, and the tenants decide that this is their chance to be free of the owner. They kill the son. And then Jesus quotes from a messianic psalm, Psalm 118, about the stone that is rejected becoming the chief cornerstone, and that is, of course, the Messiah. Now, the priests realize that Jesus has told this parable against them. They are the tenants who have not given the owner, God, the fruits he desired. And therefore, what is God going to do? Well, Jesus says he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. A withering indictment on the religious leaders and on Israel and their practices. So this is a day of questions to Jesus in the temple. For the most part, these questions were intended to trap Jesus in his words, but we will see that his answers are nothing but brilliant. So the next question is about whether or not it was right to pay Roman taxes. Now we see that the religious leaders are working really hard here to stump Jesus, and here's a really good question. But Jesus has an answer. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Now, they had thought this question out carefully, no doubt. They were sure they had Jesus caught on this one. So Mark says they were completely stunned and amazed with the way Jesus answered. Now, here's not only a brilliant answer, but it lays a very important philosophical foundation for us in the realms of government and religion. It says that these two realms can be separate. And this turns out to be very important for us for the idea of the separation of church and state. And many other religions don't have this doctrine or belief, such as Islam. Well, next is a question about the resurrection. And what is interesting about this story is that the Sadducees who asked it did not believe in the resurrection. So here they are asking a question as if they do, but of course Jesus and everyone else knows that they don't even believe in the resurrection, so their hypocrisy here is obvious. Now, they didn't believe in the resurrection because the Sadducees thought only the first 5 books of the Bible inspired, that is, the books of Moses, and not the prophets. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's really not until the later books and the prophets, for example, that the idea of resurrection begins to emerge. What's brilliant about Jesus' answer, however, is that he answers them from the first 5 books of the Bible, from Exodus. And he also specifically addresses their denial of the resurrection, and he tells them they're simply wrong in their beliefs. Well, next is the occasion where Jesus gives the great commandment. There are two sayings of Jesus to which we attach the adjective great. One is the Great Commission, found in Matthew chapter 28, and the other is this answer by Jesus called the Great Commandment. This answer is a brilliant summary of the essence of the laws in the Old Testament. These two commandments, love God and love your neighbor, also summarize the 10 commandments. And they capture the essence of the first 4 commandments, love God, and the last 6, love your neighbor. Well, Mark then records some comments by Jesus about the Messiah. He points out a passage in Psalm 110 that must have been puzzling to people. Jesus here makes it clear that this is a passage about the Messiah, and we understand from our vantage point how this refers to Jesus. And then Jesus begins to denounce the scribes. And Mark here has a short denunciation, only 3 verses. It's aimed at the scribes and their hypocrisy. And Matthew's version of these comments is much longer, almost an entire chapter. And so we think Mark is giving us here only a brief summary of a much lengthier critique by Jesus. And we would note that this is a very public scolding of the religious leaders. It's in the temple, it's in Jerusalem, it's right at the base of their power. And so this was a really bold thing to do. Of course, they had already decided that Jesus needed to die. But we see in this section that Jesus is not afraid of controversy. He speaks truths that need to be spoken, and he wanted people to understand how the religious leaders were missing the mark. And Jesus here points out their errors both for us and for the crowds that were listening to him. Now, the final story in this chapter is about the widow's offering, and here's a story that reminds us that you don't have to be rich to give to God. In this story, the poor widow gives only 2 small coins, and that would have been considered a very meager offering. But Jesus says that, in fact, it was not only acceptable, but a significant gift that she had given. Now, here's a story that's helped the church understand that it is better to judge our giving not by the amount, but by the percentage. The Old Testament standard was 10%, a tithe, but this widow had gone far beyond that. She gave 100%, and Jesus commended her for it. This story reminds us that the giving of our material blessings back to God is worthy service. As the poor widow gave back to God, well, so should we. Well, here's a very important chapter in Mark in which we learn from the wisdom of Jesus. And so read Mark chapter 12, and in the next chapter we look at some of Jesus' predictions about the future.